Is there any awards you want to bring up? Okay, so let's go ahead and get started, folks. Although I do see that people are continuing to trickle in. So today I have the pleasure of introducing Deepak Kumar, who will be our second speaker in the series. Deepak is an assistant professor in computer science and engineering here at UCSD. His research focuses on what is called socio-technical cybersecurity, so work at the intersection of society and technology and sort of understanding data-driven approaches to the safety challenges that emerge you know, in new developing technologies. His research has been used by organizations such as Let's Encrypt, Google, Amazon, and the FTC to improve the security and safety of various internet technologies. And I also asked prior to the talk today whether Deepak is recruiting any students, and he indicated that that is an option. So if you're interested, come up at the end of the talk, and I'm sure he'd be excited to talk with you. So with that, let's give a warm welcome to Deepak and thank him for joining us today.
Hello. Can everyone hear me okay? Give me a thumbs up. All right, brilliant. Well, it's really exciting to be here. I'm really excited to share some recent work we've been doing in the anti-harassment space. Before we get too deep into it, I do want to mention this is joint work with a bunch of folks from Google, UIUC, Stanford, Georgia Tech, and especially want to call out the two student authors, Catherine and Anne, who sort of led the work in the second project that I'll be talking about today. I think where I want to start is the sort of rise of socio-technical systems. So this should be no surprise, I think, to people in this room, but over the last decade, we've seen an explosion of these systems that sort of interact with our personal, our community, or our society level interests. So this is technology like social media, which I'm sure everyone in this room interacts with in some way, but it also includes technologies like the Internet of Things, these kinds of devices that we include in our homes, and even algorithmic technologies like recommender systems or recommendation algorithms. Right, so these technologies are not only changing the way that we interact with the world around us, but they're changing the way that we interact with each other. And there are lots of really amazing and positive outcomes where these things have really changed the way that the world works. There are also lots of terrible ways that these systems sort of introduce problems. And so what we've also seen is that they enable and exacerbate a number of social problems. Just by show of hands, how many people here are familiar with the platform formerly known as Twitter? Just by show of hands. Okay, brilliant. So if you're not familiar, I like to tell this story. This is the story of the repost, aka the retweet button on Twitter. So if you're unfamiliar, this is a product feature that allows users to essentially amplify to the platform content that they didn't create, but that they thought maybe was interesting or funny. And the idea of this feature was that you want to be able to spread really high quality content through the network very, very quickly. Now, of course, if you have a tool that you can use to spread content through a network really quickly, it will quickly become co-opted to do a lot of bad things. And so what we've seen is bad actors using this button, this product feature, to do a lot of terrible things like spread spam, scams, and malware, to launch coordinated harassment campaigns. And state-sponsored actors are sort of getting in the action here too. We have lots of instances of, for example, the Internet Research Agency, which was this organization that was primarily run by the Russian state, using the retweet button as the cornerstone in their operation to spread misinformation during US presidential elections, right? And of course, this is just one motivating example of how these systems can be used to cause harm. There are lots of examples. I could probably stand here and talk about many of them. So thinking of these product features, the goal of my research group, the goal of my sort of research agenda is how do we design safer socio-technical systems? And while my research group works in a bunch of these areas like scams and misinformation and harassment, I thought what would be useful today and sort of aligned with the themes of the series is to chat very narrowly about one of those harms, which is specifically online harassment. So I thought I'd give you a deeper dive on how sort of our group thinks about these problems and some of the work we've been doing in designing better systems for defending against this threat. So let's start with a definition, yeah? So what is online harassment? So online harassment is the use of technology by an individual or a group to repeatedly cause harm to another person or group. Now, when I say harm here, I'm usually talking about emotional harm, and usually this is to inflict some kind of coercive control over the person or the group that an attacker is targeting. And as it turns out, online harassment is a huge global problem. So this is some data from the Pew Research Center and from the Microsoft Digital Civility Index. Online harassment is something that about 41% of people in the United States and 40% of people globally experience or report experiencing, and these numbers are increasing year over year. Sort of to make matters worse, online harassment also often impacts people who are already at risk of harassment in the real world, for example, young people. So again, data from Pew, 46% of US teens ages 13 through 17 experienced at least one of these 6 cyberbullying behaviors, with older teen girls, the most affected, experiencing lots and lots of different types of cyberbullying. And if the just description of what online harassment is not enough to motivate you to think this is a real problem, oftentimes these things lead to some serious outcomes, right? Ranging anywhere from emotional trauma and emotional harm, and in some cases, in some tragic cases, can lead to actual real world physical harm. So this is a real problem. This is something that we should be taking very, very seriously. And my question is, given that technology plays a role in not necessarily creating the problem, but certainly exacerbating the problem, the question that I have is, well, what role does technology have to play and design have to play in actually tackling online harassment in the real world? And so that's what we're going to talk about today. If you were to ask companies, what do you think companies would say? Well, they would say, we'll use the power of AI. We'll use the power of machine learning to tackle online harassment. And indeed, in the last 5 years, what we've seen is platforms increasingly using automated techniques like machine learning to try and do something about the harassment problems that are rampant on their platform. So almost every major platform, like Facebook and Twitter and Instagram, have turned to these types of tools to sort of help with this broad area of automated content moderation for online harassment. And to give them just some amount of credit, occasionally these things do tend to work. So this is, of course, a headline from Twitter, so you take it with whatever grains of salt you want. But every so often you do see a headline like this, where a company like Twitter or X will automatically flag more than half of the tweets that violate their rules. And so you might think on the surface, okay, well, maybe this machine learning thing has something to it, right? Maybe there's something going on here that is perhaps useful. But at the same time, algorithmic audits of these algorithms often suggest that their performance that is reported by platforms is often in reality much poorer than what's advertised, and that in many cases, the decisions made by these algorithms don't actually align with people. So they don't align with users' expectations. Okay, so on the one hand, you've got AI, and that's changing the world, and on the other hand, you've got people that say the AI doesn't work. So what exactly is going on here, right? Well, a common explanation for this sort of thing I'm talking about is that for a social problem, like online harassment, users simply don't agree on what constitutes online harassment or what these algorithms should or should not be doing. And now you've got a problem, right? You've got a very tricky problem, both for users and for platforms, because now a lot of stuff on the internet falls into this kind of gray area. It is not harassing enough to necessarily warrant removal from these platforms or for a platform to take action, but it is still harassing enough to cause harm to people. So that's, of course, a tricky problem for platforms. The way I see it is that that's a design problem, right? So the design problem here is how do we actually design anti-harassment systems that can meet the expectations of users, meet the expectations of the real people that are using these systems every day. And for the rest of this talk, what I'll do is I'll share with you results from sort of 2 papers in this space. One that is focused specifically on individuals, on the individual person, and then one that is focused on trying to understand how to build these tools for communities. These are 2 papers that were published in the last couple of years. So I'll start here with a paper on trying to understand individuals. Okay, so we know that people have divergent opinions on what constitutes harassment online. And that this observation sort of for us motivated this broader question, which is, okay, we know these divergent perspectives exist, but we don't really know what they are. Why don't we go and study that? Why don't we go and ask the question, well, how do different people interpret online harassment? And helping to answer this question can give us sort of a better direction on how we might build better human-centered defenses that can help people protect themselves from the unwanted harassment that they have to deal with in the normal use of social media applications. What I will scope it to today is a focus here on toxic content, which admittedly is not my favorite term in the entire world, but has become a sort of term of the research community working in this space. The definition here borrowed from Google Jigsaw, which is a part of Google that primarily works on this area. And what we're going to be talking about here are rude, disrespectful, or unreasonable messages that are likely to make you leave some kind of online discussion. So there's a lot of other ways you can harass people using technology. Today, we're specifically scoping to the problem of toxic content. Yeah? Okay, so where I want to start in this study is we set out to answer two main research questions. So the first research question here is, when and why do users disagree about toxic content? Again, the driving question for this is to try and understand, okay, well, there are these divergent perspectives. Can we try and understand what these divergent perspectives are? And then the second question, and this becomes how do we use this, is can we somehow incorporate these types of disagreements somehow into the technology that we're building in order to improve our anti-harassment defenses today? And so these are the sort of two phases that we will talk about in the course of understanding this project. And the first thing you want to do when you are set out with a project that requires some data is that you need to go and get some data, right? So unfortunately, at the time when we were starting to do this work, there was no data set that existed that said, okay, here's how everybody in the world interprets and understands harassment. If there was a data set like that, then we wouldn't have to do any research because we'd already have the data, right? So the first thing we had to go do was design and build a data set ourselves. And so the first thing that we start with when we're talking about building a data set is figuring out what our goals are. So the goal in this project was to build a large data set of potentially toxic content, right? We don't know a priori if it is or is not going to be interpreted. That's part of the problem. But we're going to build this large data set labeled by people from very diverse perspectives. So the objective here to try and find people that come from very different walks of life. And the aim here is that we want to maximize disagreement. So we're trying to find contentious content that people across the board of the human experience might disagree on. And in understanding that, we can actually learn what these disagreements, where these disagreements stem from. And to do this, we did sort of three main things. So the first is that we designed a labeling experiment. What I mean here is we designed some kind of instrument that we put in front of people that included a bunch of content that they would eventually label and tell us sort of their opinions on it. The second thing we needed to do was to source this sort of potentially toxic content from social platforms, specifically, again, with an eye towards content that would maximize this kind of disagreement from rater to rater to rater. And then finally, we wanted to actually get that data in front of people to understand how people perceived the content in front of them. So if you're looking at this, just by show of hands, how many people here have trained a machine learning algorithm before? So a handful of people. So let me tell you this. When you're training a machine learning algorithm, let's say you have an algorithm and that algorithm's job is to discern between dogs and cats. Well, what you need is training data. And training data essentially means I'm going to have a big corpus of pictures that have labels that say this is a dog and this is a cat. And that is sort of the bread and butter of what goes into the machine learning algorithm. Now, in this task, and for tasks like that, what you usually want is agreement. What I mean by that is people generally agree on what a dog is, and people generally agree on what a cat is. And if you're doing that kind of a task, you sort of want this kind of agreement. Now, what we're doing is the complete opposite of that. What we want is to actually find content that people disagree with and get a sort of wide array of what different perspectives look like in this process. And so what I mean to say is that there's basically no playbook for this, right? Usually you say, okay, I'm going to put this content in front of people. I'm going to take the majority vote and I'm going to say, okay, that's a dog. Here, what I want to do is I'm going to take a majority vote and I want there to be no majority. I want to figure out exactly where these differences are. And the reason I'm telling you this is that we have to take a lot of critical thought to figure out how we're actually going to design the creation of this data set such that we can identify where content is in fact going to be disagreed upon. And so let me tell you about that for a little bit. So recall, right? We're looking for perspectives on toxic content that users might disagree about. And a priori, this is quite challenging, right? Again, we don't know if a piece of content is going to or not be divisive. So how do we actually identify potentially toxic content with disagreement? So where we're going to start here is we're going to use our favorite websites, Reddit, Twitter, and 4chan. And we're going to source content here because these are platforms that sort of well balance the availability of being able to get content from them in a programmatic way, while also knowing that there's probably going to be some harassment on Reddit, right? So what we're going to do then is we're going to send each of these comments through to the Perspective API. So the Perspective API is this product that is offered by Google. Essentially, this is a machine learning algorithm that scores the toxicity of each comment in isolation. So you throw a comment in, it gives you some kind of score on the other end from 0 to 1, and it tells you, okay, is this thing going to be toxic or is this not going to be toxic? Now, what we're going to do then, once we have all of these scores, is we're going to go and take a look at how well people agree on what is or what isn't toxic based on the score you get on the other end, right? So the algorithm is going to give you a score from 0 to 0.1, from 0.1 to 0.2, from 0.2 to 0.3, and so on. And what we did is we took 800 of these comments, and we put them in front of 200 people. And we sort of asked, okay, so what do you think? Is this a toxic comment or is this not a toxic comment? And what we sort of calculated was the amount of agreement, right? What fraction of the time are people agreeing on, is this, yes, a toxic comment, or is this not a toxic comment? And we measured that frequency. Ultimately, we gave them a label to sort of agree on. The 0.7 to 1.0 range we considered to be toxic. So we said, do you think this is toxic? And the 0 to 0.7, we sort of said not toxic. So this was the majority label for each thing. What we noticed is that there was pretty broad agreement when the score was below 0.3. So below 0.3, most of the time people agreed that this thing was not toxic. And then above 0.9, most of the time people agreed this was not toxic, or this was toxic. But in this sort of middle range, from 0.5 to 0.8, there was a lot of disagreement. And so what we did is, in our sort of final data set that we were creating here, we kind of upsampled content from these middle areas. Remember, we're looking for these opportunities to find kind of divisive content online. So this gave us a nice proxy for understanding, okay, this is content that we can upsample in our final data set, so that when we go and explore what the dynamics of this look like, we'll have more content that people kind of disagree on. So this is how we ultimately created the data set. And the reason I'm telling you this is not just because I think it's a kind of cool sampling technique, but I think also it's important to note, because we'll talk about this later, the distribution of our data set is not a real world social media data set, right? We are explicitly looking for like the most sort of edgy stuff, and we are putting that edgy stuff in front of people, right? In fact, like comments greater than 0.7 in our sort of algorithmic parlance make only about 3% of the total comments in sort of a random sample, and yet they account for 20% of our data set, right? So this is sort of not a random sample of social media, and that's going to become important later when we think about how we're going to evaluate this in practice. But okay, so enough about this stuff. At the end of the day, what we did is we put those comments in front of crowd raters, and we created this data set. This data set is from about 17,000 people. We labeled about 108,000 comments. Each participant labeled 20 comments, and were asked not just for sort of their perspectives, but we asked them a number of other things about themselves too. So we asked them about their identities, we asked them about their digital experiences, And our data set was sort of sufficiently diverse across identity and experiences. It was the first of its kind. It cost about like $70,000 to make this data set. So it's a pretty expensive data set to go and collect. But at the end, we have this very complicated data set of a bunch of edgy content from online and a bunch of things that people thought about that edgy content. Make sense? Brilliant. So now we got this data set. We could go and answer the questions that we wanted to go and answer, which is, okay, what exactly is going on here? And indeed, right off the bat, we're able to sort of confirm our understanding, which is that only about 15% of the comments in our data set had complete agreement. So people totally agreed that they were non-toxic or totally agreed that the content was toxic. And the remaining comments sort of exhibited this long tail of disagreement. And so the question, of course, here is, okay, it's nice to see the data. Why is this actually going on? So in order to answer this why question, we built what we call a model of participants' toxicity perceptions. So here's how this is going to work, right? What we're going to do is we're going to model each rating task. When I say rating task, I mean I'm a person who got this survey. I gave you an opinion on every comment, right? I gave you an opinion on 20 comments. We're going to model each of those tasks as a Bernoulli trial. So basically, we're going to say it's a 0 or a 1, depending on whether the comment was rated as toxic by the participant. So 0 is not toxic, and 1 is toxic. And what we're going to do is we're going to have this model depend on a bunch of different inputs, but grouped broadly into 2 categories. So we're going to say, okay, we're going to see whether or not people's identities and their experiences change the way that they would interpret a piece of content online. Now, when I say identities, I mean things like stuff about you. Are you a parent? Are you religious? What is your age? And when I say experiences, I think about, okay, well, what are your digital experiences today? So have you ever seen a toxic comment before? Have you ever been a target of a toxic comment? And of course, these are just some examples. The full model, which if you're interested, you can go check out the paper, has a bunch of other identity markers and experience markers in it as well. But basically what we're doing is we're asking the question, do your identities and your experiences play a role in how you see the world, in how you interpret whether or not content online is or is not toxic? And what we found is, yeah, as it turns out, they do. And we could even say, for the first time, here's how different people sort of interpret stuff that they see in the world, right? So what we found is, for example, the odds that an LGBTQ participant labels content as toxic is about 1.6 times higher than non-LGBTQ participants. Similarly, parents, if you have a kid, have a 1.3 times higher odds of rating comments as toxic. Racial minorities, and this is a study that was done entirely in the US, but racial minorities have a 1.1 times higher odds of rating a comment as toxic. And of course, it's not just your identities that play a role here, your experiences play a role here too, right? So participants who had been a target of toxic content in the past have about a 1.5 times higher odds of rating a comment as toxic. But conversely, and this was sort of interesting, people that have seen toxic content online but have never actually been a target of an attack actually have a lower odds of rating something as toxic, highlighting that they may perhaps simply have a higher threshold for being offended or whatever online, or even worse, that they may be desensitized to this kind of behavior just because they have been inundated with it so much in their lives. And you might ask, okay, well, models are cute. How good is this model, right? We observed that our model explains about 35% of the variance in people's perceptions. And if you're looking at that, and if you're like an engineer and you're looking at an R-squared value of 0.35, I think you'd lose your mind. You'd be like, this model sucks. But as it turns out, if you ask a psychologist, a model like this is really, really good. Like, it's astounding that you can actually explain so many of the differences in people's behaviors using these identity and experience markers. So in general, pretty good model. Okay, so we now have a sort of understanding of, yes, people disagree, and why do they disagree? Can we take this one step further? Can we ask the question, okay, can we somehow actually incorporate those diverse perspectives into some kind of design so that we can improve anti-abuse or anti-harassment defenses? And so this is sort of where we're building to. I'll tell you about how we did this. So here's the goal. What we want to do is we want to identify sort of to what extent, to some degree, personalization can play a role in improving anti-harassment systems. So the first goal, if we're going to talk about personalization, is we need to understand, like, where are we today, right? Okay, well, there's a personalized world and there's a non-personalized world. Let's talk about the non-personalized world. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to identify a global sort of threshold for the classifier that does the best for all of the people in our data set. So let me just walk through what this looks like, right? So let's take a look at how this looks like for a single participant. Remember that participant in our study gave us labels on a bunch of content, right? So here's the greens and here's the reds. This is 10 pieces of content. The greens are, this is not toxic. The reds are, this is toxic. And on the other end, we have a sort of toxicity classifier. This is any classifier you want, but in our case, we used, again, the Google Jigsaw API version. Now, what you can do to try and understand where we are at baseline is we can ask the question, okay, we can start to see what the classifier outputs at each of the thresholds that the classifier produces, and we can compare to see, okay, well, this is what the classifier says, and this is what the person says, and how well do they match up? So, for example, if you're at a threshold of 0, what this means, very concretely for the classifier, is that it's going to flag every single comment that it evaluates as a toxic comment. That's obviously not a great classifier, but that's basically what this will do if you say the threshold for this classification is at 0. So as you see in this example, this obviously is not doing a very good job, right? So saying everything is toxic, that doesn't really align that well with what this person has said. On the other side, right, if you set the threshold all the way to 1.0, well, then this would say that everything is not toxic, which of course, like, is not the best classifier either, right? So it also doesn't really neatly align with what our participant is labeled. But every value is fair game between 0 and 1. And this is continuous, let's just say 0.01, 0.02, 0.03, that kind of thing. And so you can do this, where you can say, okay, well, let's see what this looks like at 0.01. Let's see what this looks like at 0.02. Maybe at 0.03, we start to get our first not toxic. That's very exciting. And you can do this not just, for one participant, but you're doing this for all participants at the same time. And so what you're looking for is the kind of threshold that maximizes the performance, maximizes the ability of this classifier to align with what people actually think in practice. And what we found is that performance was maximized for all users at this global threshold of about 0.49. So if you were like, okay, I have a classifier, what's a good threshold for me? You'd probably come up with half. Maybe that's not the best and informed by science, but you might come up with half. And as it turns out in this case, half is totally the right number for you to be looking at. And if you were to go and evaluate this classifier in practice, what you would find is that this produced an average precision of about 0.35 and an average accuracy of 0.37. So many of you have not trained a machine learning classifier before, but let me just tell you, these are bad. These are not good. If you were to produce an algorithm that said, I'm going to give you a precision of 0.35, what that is saying is that that is making way more mistakes than it is correct. But if you're looking at these numbers and you're completely confused or baffled, remember that our data set is super weird, right? That our data set is in fact specifically designed for classifiers to be bad at it. Right? It is specifically designed for people to disagree. And so while that threshold that we talked about, that 0.49 threshold, is probably really good for some participants, it's probably really bad for other participants. And so don't look at these metrics as an actual evaluation of how this would work in practice, but look at these instead as a sort of baseline performance, our sort of baseline for the entire world that we can then compare when we go and do our personalization step. So let's talk about personalization. So how do we actually do this, right? Well, our idea, very simple idea, is essentially we're not going to do any retraining. We're not going to rebuild this classifier. We're not going to do any of that. What we're going to do is we're instead going to find a threshold, just like we did before, but instead of doing it for everyone at the same time, we're going to do it for each person. We're going to find a specific threshold per participant that maximizes their individual performance. And then we're going to aggregate all of that together, right? So for example, every participant labeled 20 of their own comments. Here is what that looks like here. We'll do that same thresholding experiment. And we'll do this because every user has different needs, right? What I might need is going to be different from what Kristen needs from the social media experience. And so some of us may require higher or lower threshold depending on our own preferences. And what we found is that in the process of doing this, we could take that our baseline classification performance of 0.35 precision and 0.37 accuracy and improve it by almost 2 times by simply doing this simple personalization step. So in our experiment, about 72% of participants experienced a performance improvement in this step, highlighting that just doing the simple thing, which is taking into account personal preferences, can go a long way in building better harassment defenses. We can actually do this personalization to improve people's everyday experience online. And so what we ultimately learned is that if we're thinking about how to build better versions of these defenses, then we have to incorporate personal user experiences. In fact, not only should we incorporate them, but actually these systems will be better because of it. That including our own experiences into the algorithm somehow actually makes them better, at least for this particular kind of task. So how would you then put this in practice? That's a great question. This is like a nice little algorithmic thing. You've shown me some performance numbers, blah, blah, blah. How might you actually operationalize this? Well, one way you could do this is you could say, everybody gets a model. You get a model, you get a model, you get a model. And give every user who wants a personalized version of this anti-harassment system, just give it to them. Say, okay, you get one too. And so the way this would work is the classifier would then flag content that the user might find objectionable above a certain threshold, and then users could then choose what they want to do with that content. Maybe they block it, maybe they mute it, maybe they put it in a quarantine folder, whatever. So here's a way that you might operationalize this in the real world. It's not top down, it's totally decentralized, and it's totally opt-in. But then there's this question, like, how would you actually find a threshold for a user? So in this context, what we did is we had essentially labels provided by people that were paid to give us labels. If you wanted to use this system, what I would have to ask you to do is to give me labels, which means I would have to probably subject you to 20 to 50 pieces of toxic content before I could build a system for you. And so we need user input. And as it turns out that this is, when we try to do this, it turns out it's a non-starter for most people. If you tell people, hey, I want to give you an anti-harassment tool, they say, great. And then you say, but you have to look at 50 pieces of terrible content. They say, I don't want to do that. And maybe that's not surprising to you. It shouldn't have been surprising to us, but it was. So what do you do then, right? We know personalization might provide all of these benefits in this context, but we can't just make every person do this, even the people that want to do this. This requires seriously motivated users. Here, we're thinking about a new idea, which is called community-driven anti-harassment tools. So here's the idea. The idea is that, okay, individuals are individuals, but individuals are oftentimes grouped, just based on the social fabric of the world, into communities. These might be communities like, we're all in this room, we're in a community. This might be a community like, I'm a journalist, and I have a bunch of other journalists, we're in a community. This might be based on your occupation, it might be based on your identity, it might be based on your experience. And these communities, especially these at-risk communities, oftentimes have really distinctive norms on how they want to interact with harassment or abusive content and the protections that they might need from these systems. So the core idea here is, well, why don't we just sort of leverage this community structure and build some anti-abuse tooling that can enable people to kind of build rules based off of the communities that they're a part of and the community expectations and the norms that they already know about. That way, you don't have to have every single person in the world do this thing. You could instead have maybe a representative from the community or a handful of representatives from the community build some sort of anti-harassment model that works for everyone. Now that is like a huge idea, and it's something that we're still working on. And what I like to do when we have these kinds of big ideas and research is we like to say, okay, well, let's just do it for one. Let's just start with one community. And so now I'll transition to talking about the second project here, which is a project that appeared at CSCW last year called Press Protect. Okay. So the context of this, I mean, is that we are going to talk about anti-harassment for journalists, specifically for journalists that are working in community with other journalists. Now, why are we talking about journalists? Well, journalists face harassment. It turns out that if you're in the public eye in today's day and age, and you're a journalist, and perhaps you're a journalist that is writing about really hot button topics that really get everybody angry, that you're gonna get a lot of harassment online. And so these attacks can range anywhere from trolling to attacks on journalistic integrity, and in many real cases, threats of serious violence or actual physical harm, right? So in many cases for journalists, specifically journalists that identify with women or journalists from marginalized identities, these sorts of things turn into death or stalking or real world physical safety challenges. Of course, at the same time, platforms that host this content don't really want to remove harassment because of this gray area problem, because they have other sorts of fear of negative externalities like regulation or whatnot. Of course, to make matters worse, journalists can't really not be on social media. So what I'm showing you here is the social media guidelines for the newsroom from the New York Times. And the things I'm highlighting is that as a news organization, we have to have a vibrant presence on social media. Of course, we're a news organization that cares about our journalists, so we support the rights of journalists to mute or block people that are threatening or abusive. So this is all stuff that's in the language of the social media guidelines at the Times, but in reality, this is not actually how things work. So there's this awesome article, it's very accessible, you should read it, by Sarah Jong, who works at The Verge, and who was previously, for about 5 years, at the New York Times. And she writes this article about her own experiences with online harassment. And she has this amazing quote from, and it's sort of paraphrased, but this amazing quote in the article. It says, "Twitter offers 2 tools to theoretically protect yourselves from blocking and muting. Since the platform indicates when you've been blocked by a user, the Times asked me not to do it to anyone because I wasn't sure what was more unsettling, getting a death threat and seeing it or not seeing it at all." Right? And so yes, your newsroom, your local newsroom might say, yes, we totally support you in muting and blocking people. But when push comes to shove, especially when there are these externalities that people can see, like, oh, this New York Times journalist blocked me, the newsroom sort of says, maybe you shouldn't block people, right? And so sort of motivated by this context, right? That this is a very unique set of, unique community of people that have some sort of anti-harassment need, we set out to do this study. And again, there are 2 research questions here. The first is, how do journalists experience online harassment and how do they protect themselves? So what do people do today? What's the status quo? And the second question here is would a defense informed by the norms of this community actually be useful? Would people use it? And if they would use it, how would they use it? And what are the pitfalls? So to go and answer these questions, again, there's a common theme. You have questions and you go get data. What we did is we started with need-finding interviews. So there's a long story here, which I don't have time for, but essentially what we did is we embedded ourselves inside of this journalist organization called the Asian American Journalists Association. They were very nice to us and very supportive of the project. And so they invited us to their convention back in August of 2022, which happened in LA, where they said, here's our journalists, please go talk to them, see what their experiences are. We're so happy to support you. So we set up a little booth outside of like the hotel bar, and we recruited people to come talk to us about their harassment experiences, specifically recruiting journalists that have experienced harassment in the past. These journalists came from a sort of wide range of experience, newsroom size and beats. So these were anywhere from individual journalists, so freelancers, all the way to people that worked at CNN, Washington Post, Boston Globe, etc. And what we did is we not only asked them a lot of questions about their experiences online, but we also asked them to do this exercise where we said, okay, we're gonna show you a bunch of stuff, a bunch of, again, potentially toxic content. What would you actually do? Would you do nothing, just keep it the same? Would you perhaps move it to a separate area, like a spam folder? Or would you proactively remove it? So would you have never wanted to have seen this content in the first place? And so we did this exercise to try and understand what journalists' needs are in this space. So the first thing that we found, again, perhaps unsurprising given all the context, but social media is a high value asset to journalists. So every single journalist that we talked to used social media, at the time, primarily Twitter and X. I think this is turning into Blue Sky, so if you're not on Blue Sky yet, you should get on it. Instagram, Facebook, and journalists use social media for a number of reasons. So first, they use it to source news stories. They use it to engage readership, to disseminate their ideas. And in particular, a lot of journalists felt that it was very important that they participate in online discussion, if not about their articles, about other people's articles as well. So there's this concept in journalism called reciprocal journalism, which is essentially the idea that in today's day and age, if you are a journalist, it is chiefly important that you have a sort of mutually beneficial exchange between you as the journalist and their audiences. And that having that kind of connection to your audiences is super, super important. And so this now has become a standard for what it means to be a journalist in the modern era. So we know social media is high value. We also know that in our interviews that online engagement is necessary for the job. So it's integral to their professionalism, right? And what we sort of found is that silencing themselves is actually sort of viewed at odds with the journalist's sense of duty. So this is a great quote that I love from the study. It says, if people want to criticize me, it is still in the public interest for people to be able to see my work. People should be able to follow me, should be able to look at my tweets because I'm a journalist and I serve the public. So there is this extraordinary sense of responsibility that all the journalists that we talk to feel in making sure that their stuff, their reporting, and their presence is very much felt online. Now, what we also found is that engagement is necessary, they felt, even when they are experiencing acute instances of harassment. And so a handful of participants stated that they were sort of more willing to interact if the exchange was related to their work, even if things were offensive or rude. But almost all of our journalists opted to defer reading. So saying, I don't want to block this. I want to see it, just maybe not right now. So the reason for this is very interesting. Journalists oftentimes use this kind of audience engagement to better understand their audience, to better understand their own stories, and in some choice cases, to monitor that kind of engagement in case there are instances of escalating abuse. So this is a profession where people do experience this kind of escalation, and that escalation is important to sort of keep an eye on as you do stuff. So what do people do then when they're experiencing harassment? Well, like we talked about, blocking is one strategy, but blocking is costly. And it's not just costly from the perspective of the reputation of the New York Times, but journalists feel that this is costly to their reputation too. So this is a great quote. It says, if you feel, it feels like, regarding blocking, it feels like you are giving up something when you choose to block someone. And they can see that they got under your skin. I worry it would cause other people to harass you too. So there is this feeling that the existing tools that are available by platforms that are available for people to use are not really applicable in a journalism context because of all of these either fears and sometimes real instances of negative externalities, either from their audiences or from their employers. So they're sort of caught in this middle ground where they can't really do that thing that they want, even if they are facing acute harassment. So just to summarize, right, what these sorts of needs are, I put them into sort of four camps. So there's utility and reciprocation. The first is that journalists need social media. They use it to contact sources, to receive tips, to gauge reader feedback. This is critical to their lives. And they are sort of encouraged, if not implicitly, then for sure explicitly, to engage in this sort of reciprocal journalism and adhere to this type of engagement with their audience as part of their professional standard. On the flip side, they want protections, but they want them to be sort of abuse resistant. So what I mean by that is they want to stay apprised of what's going on. They want to know that they're being harassed, especially during these high volume moments of harassment. We talked to a journalist who had this experience. She works on gun control. As you might know, gun control is a very touchy subject in the United States. Every time she would post an article, she would get flooded by a wave of harassing messages. But what she noted was that, when I don't post an article, it's kind of okay. People don't really know that I exist, but they do know I exist when I post an article. So there are these instances of these very high volume moments of harassment, and then it's almost like a switch got turned on and then it got turned off. What they also want is they want protections that don't validate attackers or trigger more harassment. So in this blocking case, they don't want instances where attackers know that you've blocked someone so that they get their friends to sort of attack you too and say, hey, this person blocked me. I don't know if you've seen this. I've seen this all the time on social media where somebody will get blocked and then they'll tweet and say, this person blocked me. Ha 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 ha. I can guarantee you that that person on the other end is getting a lot of harassment from that person's followers. Okay, so we have all of these needs. What we then did is we tried to synthesize those needs into a system that we call Press Protect. And so this is an anti-harassment system informed by journalists' needs. And at a high level, there are two things here. Press Protect primarily operates on content from social media, and it asks two questions about this content. The first question is this content harmful? The second question is this content relevant? Is this content related to what my work as a journalist? And so to answer the first question, we again leveraged sort of the off-the-shelf kind of harassment filters that we were talking about in the previous project. And for the second question, we built and evaluated a bunch of different types of algorithms to identify relevance. Eventually, we landed on some AI tools like GPT, but there's a lot of different ways that you can do this kind of relevance task to identify if any incoming messages are related to a given article. So I'm a journalist, I tweet an article, I'm about to get a big wave of interaction and engagement. Is the stuff that people are responding to in any way, shape, or form related to what I am writing about? And what Press Protect does is it adds these kinds of client-side UI controls for viewing harmful content. And so just to walk through this with you, right? This is an example of what Press Protect looks like. It's sort of like your standard timeline for your social media feed. And we sort of modeled this off of Twitter, because at the time, that was the most popular platform that journalists use. I don't know if that is still true today. But here's an example of what this looks like. You've got an interface that essentially has all of your tweets. None of these tweets are real, by the way, and the real content is much worse than what I'm about to show you. So here we've got this sort of matrix, this kind of, is it relevant, is it irrelevant, and is it not toxic, is it toxic? Now, if you are a journalist, you can at any point click show replies. By default, what this is going to show you is all the replies that we think are relevant or irrelevant, but that are not flagged as harmful in some way. And so, you can have all of these comments. Sometimes these comments can be, spicy, but they are not flagged as harassment by our underlying technology. If a journalist wants, they can then click on show hidden replies. And we hide things that are toxic, but the first layer is that we show things that are toxic but relevant. So this is not a particularly toxic content, a piece of toxic content, but it gives you a sort of example of a flavor of the kind of UI we're talking about, where we are hiding the content that is toxic, but when you click on it, you see all of the relevant stuff first. So you get a sense of, okay, well, I did write about gun control, and there are 5 comments, and they're all angry at me, but they're about gun control, and so maybe I should get a sense of what people are saying about gun control. The last category, and this sort of toggle bar at the bottom, is you can show replies that are irrelevant and toxic. And so these are things that are just like, okay, just meaningless sort of attacks. Oftentimes they are personal attacks that have sort of no basis. And the UI here, I should note, is designed to be flexible to user controls. So these are the defaults that we presented that we sort of thought were sensible, but the user on the other end, the journalist, actually has complete control over this. They can say however that is that they want to engage with their online experiences, how they can choose to configure the system, right? And so the idea here is, if you think back to our first paper, we think about thresholds. The thresholds are like this abstract idea. If I were to ask, a random person in the audience, like, hey, what do you think about a threshold of 0.23? You'd probably say, I don't have any idea what you're talking about. But if I say, hey, do you want to see harassing content and relevant content, or harassing content and irrelevant content? Well, now we can actually have a conversation. And so this is the kind of thing that we want to expose as a design principle, not the nuts and bolts or the guts of the algorithm, but these sort of higher level categories that journalists can sort of toggle to see how well they fit. So what did we actually do then? When we built the system, I think that's wonderful. What we did is then we took this system and we went back to the journalists, some of which we talked to before, and new journalists too. And we said, all right, listen, we have built the system. We know that you are someone who experiences harassment. Would you like to try our system and tell us what you think about it? So we evaluated this with 8 journalists who were sort of active on Twitter, authored tweets, promoting their stories, and that we know, because these are public accounts on Twitter, received replies that were harassment. And so these were 2 participants from our sort of initial need-finding interviews to sort of have some internal consistency, but we also wanted to see how well this would work on a whole new set of people that had no idea what we were talking about in the first place. And so what we found is that in general, journalists like this stuff. In fact, they felt that Press Protect protected them against harassment and that the system could meaningfully generalize to serve other visibly online users. So other users, other communities of people that by virtue of their profession or their community have to be online. They felt that the value of customization was really critical. So for a wide range of different personal preferences, they were excited about the fact that they could make these sorts of tweaks to the UI, tweaks to the ways the algorithm works, etc. And I think this was the most exciting part. Participants didn't feel that the introduction of something like this would hinder valuable interactions with readers. In fact, they felt that it would enable them to have more valuable interactions with readers who are operating in good faith, and that, like, in some cases, these algorithms do, of course, make mistakes, but in some, the journalists were satisfied with this trade-off, that they said, okay, look, we're happy that sometimes, yes, it does put people in a bad box that shouldn't be in the bad box, but we're happy to have that rather than having to see all the bad stuff all the time. So this was very exciting. Of course, people had gripes and thoughts as well, right? So I think the biggest thing here is that right now the system does not make any sort of distinction between this sort of escalation landscape, in this escalation to physical threats. So what participants really wanted was a distinction between imminent physical threats and other types of harassment. That, in fact, I want to triage the personal attacks that are making fun of my face from the, like, I know your address and I'm going to find you. And that makes a lot of sense, right? And so 5 participants wanted such threats. Basically everyone was saying this. They were saying, okay, look, we really need these threats to be flagged. The harassment thing is very nice, but we also need these other knobs here too. And one participant was sort of critically concerned with Press Protect potentially obscuring threats behind multiple layers of indirection. Of course, at the same time, these types of preferences are also really individually driven, right? So one participant, whose quote I like a lot, said, I would stop using Press Protect because of my bias towards wanting to see everything. So I just want to, at some point, have seen them all. You really need to monitor what people are saying to make sure that that doesn't translate into physical danger. So this was exciting for us because it was like, okay, well, we went through the process, we designed something, we built something, we put it in front of people, and we learned more things, which means there's more to do. And that is the sort of iterative aspect of design that personally I really like in doing this kind of research. Okay, so let me tell you just a little bit about some of the limitations, and then I'll sort of wrap it up here. So we did want Press Protect to be this sort of real-time system. We were building it to be a real-time system. Then Elon Musk bought Twitter and everything sort of didn't work out. It became kind of prohibitively expensive to do this. Elon was charging, I think, $42,000 a month to do the thing that we could have done for free before. But there are lots of opportunities to deploy these things in new platforms, like Blue Sky, for example. It does rely currently on a lot of external tooling. So it relies on like Perspective API, which is, who knows if that's going to be around forever. And it relies on OpenAI, and who knows if, if OpenAI is going to be around forever. So in deployment in practice, what we need to do is try to minify this to make this sort of individually run on its own. And this is an area of research that I'm super excited about. And then, of course, the last thing here is that privacy is a big concern for people. So I don't feel like the trade-off should be, okay, I'll give you harassment protections, but then Google and OpenAI are going to learn everything about you and everything about your protections. So we're really thinking about how we can make these models smaller, how we can make these models fit inside of, say, someone's computer so that they don't have to trade off their privacy in order to have this kind of protection. Okay, so what did we learn about community defenses then, right? What we learned is that anti-harassment needs are multidimensional, right? And they're shaped by community. So simply filtering content with machine learning does not work for everyone. The abstraction that we built was effective and users appreciated their control, but there was this emergent need to think about, okay, well, what are the types of threats that I'm experiencing? And those threats are going to be very different than threats for other communities, right? This sort of translation and escalation from online world into real world is something that journalists experience, but may not be true for other communities, something that we have to figure out. And then the participants did feel that the tool could be generalizable, and to me, that's next. So let me just tell you a little bit, as I wrap up here, about where I'm excited about working in this space, and if you're excited about it too, you should come talk to me. So the first idea here is to think about, okay, well, we know a lot of these things that I've been talking about are, well, harassment happens. and there's nothing we can do about it. Well, as it turns out, there are actually a lot of things we can do about it, and the idea here is with interventions. So an intervention is essentially a mechanism that says maybe we can stop somebody from posting harassment in the first place using some design trick or some design method. And the idea here is that we might be able to use explanations. So explanations are increasingly common in machine learning systems. They've been shown to help users sort of better understand what is this model doing and why is it doing that thing. And the idea here is maybe we can use explanations to explain why certain content is construed as abusive before people post that content in the first place. Now, there are a lot of questions. What explanations are effective? How do you evaluate this stuff? Can you actually do this on the fly? Can you do this in an automated way? Because yes, it would be great if I sat down and explained every comment on the internet, but that's obviously not going to work. And then what kinds of abusive interactions does this intervention work for? Where does it fail? Right? It's not going to work for all users, but it's going to work for some. And where that line is, where that curve is something that's very exciting in terms of an area of research. And of course, I want to do more community work. So I want to scale up Press Protect to other at-risk communities. There's so many questions, like what are community norms at all? What can be automatically encoded? How do we empower end users without burdening them with all of this choice? How do we balance moderation with these issues of free speech? These questions of filter bubbles. And I would love to build out a real-time Press Protect on Blue Sky. To my understanding, based off of the existing APIs, this is totally possible. So if somebody wants to help get that to life, come talk to me. I'll leave you with this sort of last thought, which is designing anti-harassment defenses ultimately requires centering the person or the community. And when you do that, not only do the systems get better, but doing so will enable a better and safer experience of socio-technical systems for all users. Thanks for being here. You've been a great audience. I'm happy to take any questions.
Okay, so I think we should have time for one or two questions. Maybe we'll start over here and then Luna. So,
like I know you said like the explanations in the future, but currently for the Press Protect, if you were the commenter commenting something, would you know what your comment was flagged as to the original
You would
poster?
not. So this would be not this is only transparent to the journalist, only to the person who's receiving the content. There's no signal to the outside world.
Oh.
Yeah.
No, I was just thinking in my own brain.
okay, and I will run over for our second question.
All right, this one's a bit long, but I really appreciate your research, and I agree that harassment should be tackled on social media to help people feel safe, and I do agree that people do need different protections. But with companies like Meta recently explicitly allowing hateful content against like immigrants, religion, LGBT individuals, and gender, TikTok hiding content that criticizes President Trump, yet not any other politician, and Twitter having banned words like cisgender under harassment, it's clear that at least as of late, there's a select few people who can decide what does and doesn't constitute harassment on centralized platforms. If this is true, why do you think that these platforms still have millions of active users and we haven't seen platforms like Reddit, who do allow for a more decentralized approach to moderation in which community users are often moderators themselves, and allow for custom rule sets and harassment filters for each community, have seen like massive growth? Like Reddit hasn't grown that much in the past couple of months and or years. And if according to the research, users would benefit from this.
It's a great question. It's a hard question because I don't have science to back this up. I just have my own thoughts and my own vibes. I think my understanding is, if you were to ask me just my own personal opinion, I think the community-centric view that Reddit takes is something that we should be trying to embed in all of our social systems. That actually there are obviously lots of problems with Reddit, there's no doubt about it, but that this type of a community-focused approach to social spaces is the way. It is the way to have safer interactions. It is the way to have more pleasant interactions. It's the way to make social media more fun. I mean, I don't know how many people here used to use Facebook before it became this sort of like horrible, like decrepit version of itself. But these centralized platforms are sort of in decay. I think there is a world where we're seeing a lot of interest, for example, in Blue Sky, which has experienced like massive growth in the last 3 months. Not yet, but it has the tools to allow you to do that. right? So you have APIs that you can use to build your own versions of stuff. And Blue Sky has said that they're going to allow people to run their own servers and run their own types of APIs. So I think this is something that we're going to keep watching. Why these systems exist today is in part because they have existed and therefore they exist. But I think there's a cool opportunity, especially with some of these new technologies, to actually like build stuff that people are excited about. And so that's sort of where I stand on it. Yeah.
Okay, if you have any other questions, which I'm excited to see that there are, please come up. I'm sure Deepak can hang around for a couple of minutes to take those at the end. Let us give him a round of applause as a thank you, and I will see you all next week.
Thanks, everyone.